Yeah, you mentioned that you're going to be doing this particular director. I said, why? I know it's on the syllabus, but why did you pick him? And I paused, and before I could answer, he says, what does it have to do with me? How will Tarkovsky speak to me? And I actually had to take a breath. I thought, wow, things have changed. This is a different group of students. I'd never had that question, and actually it was a terrific question.
You're listening to Speaking of Language, a podcast recorded at the Language Resource Center at Cornell University. Each week, we explore a topic related to language pedagogy and second language acquisition. This week, on Speaking of Language,
Tom Garza joins us to expand on his recent talk on optimizing teaching for Gen Z learners and differentiated language instruction.
Welcome to a new episode of Speaking of Language. I'm Angelica Kramer, the director of the Language Resource Center at Cornell University.
And I'm Sam Lupowitz, the LRC's media manager. Today, we have the pleasure of welcoming Dr. Tom Garza to our studio. He recently gave a talk as part of our monthly LRC speaker series on Gen Z learner identities and differentiated language instruction.
We will extend our conversations about the current generation of students and what we as educators can do to provide inclusive and equitable instruction. Welcome to Speaking of Language, Tom.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here.
And we are so delighted to have you.
So we'd definitely like to get into your talk and everything, all the wisdom you had to offer us. But we always like to start our podcast by asking our guest about their background and path with languages. So what does that look like for you?
Wow. I guess the most direct route I had into realizing that language was a malleable force in the world was growing up speaking Spanish and English in the same household. And not realizing until I was probably around age 5 that they were actually two separate languages rather than just simply this really cool way of having different words for the same object. And my parents spoke almost exclusively Spanish between themselves, but more English with my sister and me. So we grew up also thinking that language was a kind of code that you could use to hide what someone could understand or to express something to someone who was a partner with you. So that was my kind of intro to it. But I had no idea it was actually two different languages. And then very probably smartly, but I didn't know it at the time, started Latin in high school, which got me through a lot of legal translations later in college.
Oh, I bet, yeah.
But it was in college that I started studying Russian, and I've never looked back. That was just the beginning of a wonderful relationship.
And what do you currently do at the University of Texas at Austin?
So at the University of Texas at Austin, I'm an associate professor in the Department of Slavic and Eurasian Studies. I teach Russian at the very beginning level, but also at the advanced level, 4th and 5th year Russian, as well as all kinds of courses in cultural studies and literary studies. I'm also the founding director of the College of Liberal Arts Texas Language Center. We just had our 15th anniversary, so
look
we've
at
been
that.
around a bit. Yeah.
Wonderful. Fantastic. So, Tom, at the beginning of your talk, you reviewed Gen Z learners and how the profiles of our language students have changed over the years. Can you please recap this current generation of students for our listeners and how they are different from millennials?
Yeah, I remember, I'll tell a short anecdote. My encounter with Gen Z was doing a course that I'd been teaching for nearly 2 decades, a gateway course on using Russian science fiction as a large enrollment. I think I had 250 first-year students in this course to get them just kind of interested in the subject matter. There's a bunch of these large courses that all first-year students take. Mine was on Russian sci-fi. And I just kind of was going through the syllabus, the usual first day of class things. You know, this is who I am, this is what the course is, and so forth. And a number of hands go up, which is unusual. That hadn't happened. This was about 5 years ago, just before COVID. And I sure. What's the deal? It's kind of you mentioned that you're going to be doing this particular director. I said, why? And I had the same kind of reaction, a little bit of, what? I said, I never, because it's on the syllabus? No, not because it's on the syllabus. Well, I said, this is a really interesting director, and his works, I think, from the Soviet period. This was Tarkovsky, one of the great Soviet directors of Russian sci-fi and other films as well during the 1960s, 70s, and even into the 80s. Anyway, and the student says, no, that's not what I mean. I know it's on the syllabus, but why did you pick him? And I paused, and before I could answer, he says, I mean, what does it have to do with me? How will Tarkovsky speak to me? And I actually had to take a breath. I thought, wow, things have changed. This is a different group of students. I never had that question, and actually it was a terrific question.
Yeah.
And I wound up completely going off script and talking about the whyness, which is what we do in the humanities. We answer that big question, and had one of the best discussions I've ever had in the first day of class.
Wow.
So anyway, that was my kind of, oh gosh, things have really just suddenly shifted for us. Right around, I said, 2018, 2019. And since then, these students, even through COVID, while we were on Zoom doing our courses, have, in my view, a very different approach to taking in subject matter, wanting very much, the key word to me always is relevance. What is it about this subject, about what you're saying, about what I'm reading or what I just read that applies to me right now at this moment, which, again, a great way to approach learning and helping me readjust how I did teaching.
Yeah. Interesting.
Sorry for the long-winded
No, absolutely.
background there.
Yeah.
Not at all. So, in order to speak to the many different intersectional learner identities these students bring into our classrooms, you propose differentiated instruction as a tool for equity.
I do.
So, what are the hallmarks of differentiated instruction, and what is the rationale for incorporating this approach into the language classroom?
So if I may, I'll answer those in reverse order, only because
Terrific.
I think the rationale is why I think I'm moving and trying to get my instructors to move in this direction. Around that's the time that the shift in generational learners or students from millennial learners to this Gen Z group around 2018, at least for university level faculty. My sister, just sidebar here, my sister was a principal in a local middle school in Austin, Texas, and she had commented on this different kind of learner several years even before 2018. So they were coming down the pipeline, obviously, and now I was seeing them for the first time. But I have seen physically, which is kind of a lovely thing to look at who is in the classroom, a shift demographically in who is represented in our classes. And I challenge almost any instructor that I encounter, to think back 20 years ago, who was taking our world languages, and look at your classes now. And really, let's be honest, it's different in a very positive way, in my view. So given that we've got very heterogeneous populations in our classes now, ethnically, racially, in gender terms, in sexual orientation terms, in what I like to call wealth terms, in terms of economic access, in access to education. How many more first-geners do we get? All of that. That diversity of learner types and of identities on top of the proficiency differentiation we get, on top of the learner style differentiation, visual versus audio versus analytic and so forth, led me to say we can't just be teaching from a single textbook all of our time. And so DI, differentiated instruction, is one way of approaching that diversity in our classes. It is trying to have the instructor ask, what can I do to make the content that I know the learners need to have to be able to speak German or Arabic or Chinese or Russian or Spanish or French, to be able to make it relevant to each and every one of the students in the class. And trying to give students access to the material we're learning by giving them that kind of access, so that you try to stop asking questions as someone who's never been abroad before in their lives. What did you do what did you see in your first trip to Europe? As one of the prompts, which we would get in our textbooks for back 20 years ago and so forth, right? What was your first trip abroad like? Remember that trip. to use past tense, right? And
Right.
students who'd never been abroad would create something, imagine something, I suppose. That's what I did in my first year Russian class, having never been abroad before. Yeah. So,
Can you give another specific example of what this differentiated instruction would look like in the language classroom? You talked about specific tasks related to one theme or one topic that can vary within a classroom because we know, as you said, right, students have different background,
Right.
different background experiences, different things are relevant to them. So what could that look like?
right. So the topic, let's say, at you're maybe midway through a first-year course, and as so many of us will have, a topic on clothing, for example, where you want to just cover the lexical field of different things to wear, plus all of the grammatical constructions of putting on clothes, taking off clothes, changing clothes, all of that kind of thing. So that's your kind of frame. You've got lexical, grammatical, syntactic, pragmatic
Right.
information that you know you want to convey. But you've got this very diverse group of learners. What can you do with all of that? Well, so the learner who, for example, may not be someone who buys a new outfit every other day or something, you might want to be aware and attentive to that learner's background in assigning a kind of task to do. So for a group that is lower proficiency, but say has a lot of experience shopping and so forth, you might want to simply give them an online catalog from Neiman Marcus, or
Right.
it can be from Walmart. Doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. And let them go through and pick out an outfit, right? Pick out the items of clothing, write them down, because again, this would still be, say, the novice high to advanced threshold level. But a student who's maybe a little bit more advanced in terms of their proficiency, maybe working harder or just simply better at it at that point, might have a task that allows them to interact with another student. And they've moved beyond that memorized singular word item, and they're working now on interacting on the sentential level. But again, being attentive then to who the learners are in terms of their own identity. So if they've never done online shopping before, maybe have them instead have a conversation about real life shopping, something like that. Again, it sounds like it's a heavier burden on the instructor than it actually is, in my view. I've found that instructors who, in the same breath that they would say, I like to know the names of my students, also can find out bits and pieces of their identity without violating, FERPA laws or anything like that.
Right.
It's not like you're asking for detailed information, but just getting to know who they are, even as part of the learning group that you've got in your classroom.
You just mentioned websites as a resource for teaching and learning. What is the role of authentic materials in this differentiated approach?
Probably the most important part of, in my view, any classroom in teaching a world language, but especially if you're trying to do this kind of individuated, project-based instruction, is to be able to have all your learners need to have that access to materials that are not designed for the purpose of teaching language and culture, but rather are materials that they would encounter on, if they're able to go to another place, if they can go abroad or to another place where the language is spoken and used, terrific. That's great, and they'll see a lot of those things there. But they don't have to have that luxury of going abroad. Sure. It could be simply through their own laptop or handheld device, is to have that face-to-face encounter virtually through a website with those materials. So yes, getting them used to hearing not scripted or edited audio, video, textual material from the very first day. From the very first day, in my view, is just the key element to making proficiency-based instruction happen and to make these projects be manageable.
Nice. Yeah. So you actually shared an example of a project-based learning model or module that was related to food.
Right.
We all love food, at least we at the LRC do.
I do too.
Sam is nodding.
Yep.
What did this project look like, and what were your students' reactions to this approach?
Thank you for asking that. It's a terrific question, because I think you're right. The student affect why would we even do this kind of shift in pedagogy if it was something the students didn't like or didn't respond to? So, in short, the response to individuated instruction has, from the first moment that I began implementing it, been so positive. And I think that is, without being too generalist, I think that is an overarching trait of Gen Z is if you're paying attention to who I am, I respect you. It is the most empathetic generation I've encountered in my 66 years. I've never had a group interacted with another human being that had this immediate, thank you for asking that question. Thank you for thinking of me. And without actually sounding, egotistical. So simply, thank you for thinking about me. Anyway, so in the case of food, it's a great topic. The focus actually was on getting students to think about how to approach going out and eating in a restaurant, keeping in mind budgetary concerns. Not everyone can afford to go to the same kind of places.
Sure.
Dietary concerns, vegetarian, veganism, all these kinds of things. Religious constraints on what can and can't be ordered in a restaurant. And as we get, say, broader in interpretation, what are the options in, say, eating out in this exercise? It was back in the day when you could travel to Russia, it was about eating out in the many, many options there are to eat in Moscow. And so, thinking about individual learners, what about if you wanted to celebrate someone's birthday as well as go out to eat? What if you wanted to be able to have a place that's outdoors to eat? What if you wanted to be able to have a place where you could order a nice bottle of local wine or something like that? So the tasks then are distributed in a way that allowed students to use virtual resources to get online. It's actually a website that's still there, even post war and during the war, I should say now, and post-COVID, that you can get online and survey all of the different restaurant options in the city of Moscow. It's really cool.
Yeah.
But obviously, because it's being driven by the individual using it, it is kind of self-leveling as a task. You can't go beyond what your ability lets you do. So the tasks then say, okay, here's the general frame. Find a restaurant that's the kind of cuisine you like, that's within your budget. So again, each individual student has their own set budget. And this website tells you what the average cost of a full meal is there, right? And then think about the kind of side benefits, right? What about if you do want live music, or you want to sit outside, or you want something by the river? So you have to find all those things. Cool. So I love using authentic materials again here because that self-leveling quality that students will always go to what I'm attracted to, sorting through the different varieties out there. All of that requires language processing, language use.
Absolutely.
And then that they actually come up with something that's theirs, right? That it's their creation, their product is so rewarding. And again, that's now to that second part of the question. They find it very rewarding to have being able to kind of hold it up and say, look what I did.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah.
Very cool. More broadly speaking, what differences in classroom engagement or proficiency have you seen as a result of differentiated instruction?
Well, I think regardless of approach, even if you weren't using differentiated instruction, when an instructor or a group of instructors finds materials, methods, practices, approaches to language learning, teaching, that then the learners are participating in, that it really is a kind of collaborative process of learning, proficiency levels, and we've got to get probably more empirical studies on this, but we're starting to, but certainly anecdotally, proficiency levels tend to go up even more quickly than in a traditional grammar-based or notional functional syllabus would indicate. And I think that has everything to do with what we already know about language acquisition. If you actually are using the language while you're acquiring it, if it's being practiced all the time and you're enthusiastic and eager to do that kind of work, then proficiency will go up accordingly.
Yeah, and going back to what you said, relevance, right?
Exactly.
If the learner notices or sees that direct tie to their life, to their situation, then that has a positive impact on their motivation and keeping at it.
Right, right. And keep in mind, of course, right, our learners are not, if I think back to my generation, we're not in the classroom just to learn how to read the great works of X.
Sure.
That I'm not taking German just because I want to read Goethe. I'm not taking Russian because I want to read Tolstoy. I'm taking Russian because I'm a petroleum engineer and Russian's important to me. Or I'm interested in first responder care because we have a large Russian population in Austin or something like that. They tend to be very practical and very, again, individuated reasons for studying our languages.
How do you figure out what those student interests are? Do you survey your students at the beginning of class?
Great question. Yes, one could take the, I think, more circuitous route of just in class as you do those first few weeks of getting to know students based on the language instruction, right? So when you start asking, what is your name? Where are you from? What does your mother do? Who is raising you, right? If we start talking, again, these wonderful terms of family, you can find out that way. It's a little more, it works, but it takes a while. It takes a few weeks of instruction before you have a reasonable profile of your learners. Before classes even start, the way I've gone around this is I think most of us get at least preliminary roll of who's enrolled in our courses before classes start. And I sort of preemptively email all of them with a very brief Google Doc questionnaire that they fill out. Again, nothing FERPA
of course.
Related on it, so I don't ask what is your sexuality or things like that.
Yeah.
But I do ask things, again, it's all optional. They can choose to answer the question or not, but I ask things like pronouns, for example. What pronoun do you prefer? What pronoun preference do you have? What do you use? I do ask things like, are you the first person in your family to be at a university?
Right.
I ask those kinds of questions.
Absolutely.
So they're not just direct question answer, a kind of what is this, but rather a more open question to encourage them to just spill more. And I usually get more information probably than I even asked for in the questionnaire about them.
Yeah.
A few students won't respond, and that's fine. That's fine. And we just respect the privacy of the students who choose not to give us as much information. That's fine too. Yeah.
I love that approach. That's great.
Yeah. So we know how busy language educators are.
Yes.
How can they effectively provide differentiated tasks for their students and still find the time to eat and sleep and grade and maybe have a life? Who's to say? Where can they start tomorrow?
Great question. Yes, let me start by saying if it's your first deep dive into a DI, there is an investment of time and effort to get started. It is, in a funny way, sort of like growing mushrooms, though. Once you start and you've got your first crop going, they self-propagate very quickly. The exercises, in a sense, you can use them more than once, obviously, or the tasks that you've developed for this or that profile of learner. Those kinds of exercises can be repeated, or those tasks can be repeated, for one. And two, I found, now I'm having been doing this for about nearly 10 years, one's facility of coming up with an idea for how to address this or that profile, because they are going to be varied each time, sort of slightly different. That's a good thing. Becomes more efficient. I find that it's easier for me to say, right, I know exactly what kind of, where to send you, either in web space or in practical space, in physical space, what to do. So there's that. But that in a way is avoiding the question, dodging the question. In the first iteration, instructors sort of need to start looking at their own syllabus and seeing what space do they have in the thematics of the syllabus. What topics are being covered, or what kinds of things, what outcomes do they want from those topics, so that they can see where is there room to be able to differentiate.
Right.
To say, well, okay, here's where I would normally do, I don't know, an in-class quiz. Rather than doing an in-class quiz, what if I gave a small task and used that period of time for an in-class impromptu exercise that would be done in, say, pairs or groups of three of the students in the classroom. And what it would involve would be coming up with a handful of prompts that they would respond to in either conversation or an activity that would allow for differentiation to begin. And it's kind of these small steps of doing 1 or 2 things a week even that I think will eventually help that instructor get confidence in, I can do this. And I do actually. It doesn't take that much more time. It's simply swapping out what I used to do one way and doing it a different way now. Yeah.
Nice. That's great. So what is up on the horizon for the next generation of students? Generation Alpha is knocking on our doors, right? They will enter higher education in a few years. If you look into your crystal ball, how do you see language education changing further?
Oh, Angelica, you're begging a question of my retirement here.
I do not.
No, okay.
Redact. We're done. I'm not asking that question. We can't have you retire, Tom. Come on.
Well, I do see Gen Alpha knocking at our door. I actually already think we can see a difference in the now later entrance of Gen Zers, the way we saw early millennials and later millennials. Right. There was a shift between, the first millennials, the kind of hipsters that fell in the middle, and then the later millennials that began to be a bit more like the Zers. The later Gen Zers, I think, are giving us a nod or an indicator to what we may be seeing in Gen Alpha. And there is obviously one big unfortunate kind of elephant in the room, and of course that's COVID.
Right.
COVID is sort of the marker, this big 3 to 4 year thing that has so affected late Gen Zers, and I think is going to be the marker of Gen Alpha of how does one approach an individual, the human factor of an individual who has had to live a substantial enough part of their young lives with very limited human contact, very limited interaction, and that the predominant mode of interaction during that period of time is not real. It's virtual. Yikes. I mean, I think it's been difficult enough with the older, already in their late teens, 20-ish Gen Zers who came to us and took their last years of high school or first years of college online to try to get them a bit reacculturated to what socialization is in a real world setting. To younger learners, I think those of us who are teaching at university levels are going to have to, for the first time maybe in our careers, actually do a bit of real, and I'm using the term markedly here, pedagogy, the teaching of children, literally, that we are going to have to re-educate. I know that sounds terribly structuralist, but I mean it, having to teach how to learn.
Absolutely.
Again, that is a big extra burden on us. So we're teaching German, Russian, French, Spanish, and we're teaching how to be a student again.
Yeah, no, this is interesting. You mentioned teach how to learn. When I was in, probably would have been what is middle school here in Germany, there was an after-school club that was titled Learn How to Learn.
Right.
And that was transformative, right? Because, I mean, even in any of my schooling up to that point, I don't think anybody ever really taught you how to learn.
Yeah.
But there was, a dedicated person who would walk you through, this is what you should do, these are some strategies.
Exactly.
And maybe we need to make that mandatory in every year of every educational level.
Well, to your point, I mean, if DI is very heavily project-based and task-oriented, if you're even considering doing things like pair work or group work, small group work, for entering freshman, first-year students who are coming into our universities and colleges and community colleges, they have, in some cases, have real socialization issues about working with another person face-to-face. How then do we make that bridge to get them not only work face-to-face with another live person, but to do it in a language that's not their own? Right, yeah.
Well, it'll be interesting. We'll revisit this
Another
conversation
challenge.
in a few years.
Sounds like a good plan. Tom, where can our listeners find out more about differentiated instruction and about you and your work?
Well, I'm delighted at any time. I always put up my own email address, tjgarza@austin.utexas.edu, at any time to get in contact with me through our website at the University of Texas, the Texas Language Center. It's actually very easy. If you go to the University of Texas at Austin main page and in the search, simply put in the letters TLC, which is easy to remember.
Yeah,
we are the first thing that pops up. So I encourage that interaction. There are growing numbers of external resources now. The field, as it were, is a relatively young one of differentiated instruction. Our first main publication started coming out around the beginning of this, the new century, around 2008, 2009. But dedicated work, really focused work, has begun only in the last 5 years, really just before COVID, I think. And it couldn't have been more timely because a lot of DI practices were used online. So, So I encourage anyone who's interested to please feel free to contact me or any number of the others who are out there working in this area.
Great.
Yeah.
Are there any exciting projects at the Texas Language Center that our listeners and us, of course, should be aware of?
We just finished up a year-long series of talks on translation studies in languages, literatures, and cultures. And we're about to start our new series for this year, which is on language use in diaspora. We're starting off with a really interesting project, for example, with it's a spin-off from our Turkish in Translation project that's going to look at James Baldwin's work with African diasporic populations in Italy.
Oh, wow.
Decades ago. It was just his 100th centenary, his 100th anniversary. And so we have a wonderful graduate student in comparative literature, İpek Sahiliner, who is going to be chairing this little roundtable. She'll be our kind of kickoff for this session roundtable discussion about looking at African diaspora in Turkey. Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah. Yeah,
Wonderful.
So that's our first big event coming up for next year for 2024-5.
Nice.
Fabulous.
Yeah.
Well, Tom, we could talk to you about this all day. But before we sign off, please share a word with us in a language you speak, love, are learning, want to learn, that feels good to say. What do you have for us?
So this is a word that is Soviet-era word that was my favorite word in my first year class because it was the hardest word to say. It was sort of the supercalifragilisticexpialidocious of Russian. And yet it came up so often because as soon as one would get to Russia and you would take a Soviet Union at that time and take any kind of tour around the city, the tour guide would talk about and here's the word, достопримечательности.
Oh.
So достопримечательности are the wonderful sights around the city.
Yeah.
So they would say, look at all of the wonderful things you can see in Moscow.
Nice.
And they would say, so today on our tour, you're going to see a number of достопримечательности. And all of the first-year students would be repeating this one word because it was, if you could get this word out, you were on your way. So that's my word of the day, my mot du jour.
I love it. That's awesome. It does make you smile, doesn't it?
It does make you smile.
Well, Tom, we agree with the closing statement of your talk. Teach who we are, teach as we are.
Thank you.
So thank you for the work you do, and thank you for speaking of language with us today.
Angelica, thank you so much. Sam, thank you as well. It was my pleasure, and at any time, I'm at your service.
Join us next week for our annual Thanksgiving special. We'll hear about gratitude from the LRC team and extended family. Until then,
Auf Wiederhören!
The Language Resource Center is located on the ground floor of Stimson Hall on Cornell's main campus in Ithaca, New York. Check us out on the web at lrc.cornell.edu.
And follow Cornell LRC on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter.
Speaking of Language is produced by Angelica Kramer and Sam Lupowitz.
Recorded by Sam Lupowitz.
Original music by Sam Lupowitz, Dan Gable, and Joe Gibson.
Thanks also to the College of Arts and Sciences at Cornell University.
As a reminder, the ideas and opinions expressed on this podcast do not reflect those of the College of Arts and Sciences or any other official entity of Cornell University.
We thank our listeners, and do stay tuned for our next episode.
How do you say supercalifragilisticexpialidocious in Russian?
They would use the same phrase.
Oh,
Yeah.
they do?
Yeah, they would
because
simply.
it's different in German, slightly different.
Really?
Well, because you can't rhyme anything that ends in docious.
Ocious. Yeah, precocious. No. Oh,
So it's
so I haven't heard this. So normally, I think I've seen the film in Russian, and I think they keep the songs intact.
oh, how
and they'll run
interesting. Oh, just the
subtitles.
translation. Oh, that is wild.
That's what I remember seeing.
Really?
I remember seeing the film in
Oh, that
Say
is
the
so
early
fascinating.
80s. Yeah.
Because we even
Oh, now
saw
that you said this,
the
Angelica, I'm now going to have to go and look.
yeah,
and
no,
I'm gonna check it out.
I'm curious, and I mean, whatever. We have the internet at our fingertips.
Yeah, exactly.
But I remember a couple of Christmases ago, actually, we saw the musical in Germany. And it's in German, it's supercalifragilisticexpialigetisch. Dieses Wort ist durch und durch furchtbar weich. Synthetisch. Wer es laut genug aussagt, scheint klug und fast prophetisch.
Wow.
Supercalifragilisticexpialigetisch. There, you may call me Mary Poppins.
You are a poppin. That was brilliant.
Chim chim tree.